very good morning to all my students of class 12. I hope you all are well, you all are enjoying your stay with your parents, and at the same time maybe you all are studying or giving first priority to your studies. Now today we shall continue with the lesson Constitution. In the last class we already had a look at the different types of constitutions: the written constitution, the unwritten, the rigid, the flexible, the enacted and the evolved constitution. And besides that, we also had a look at the merits and demerits. And then we also discussed whether a constitution can be purely written or purely unwritten or purely flexible or purely rigid. So we came to know that all of the constitutions cannot be divided in a watertight compartment. That means there cannot be any constitution which is purely written or purely unwritten or purely rigid or purely flexible. So there is a mixture of both rigidity and flexibility. Now today we will have a look at the conventions, the meaning of the term conventions. Now before I move on with the meaning of the term conventions, now let me give you an example. Now since you all are the members of different family, and at the same time now when it comes to some celebrations or festivals, now what do? You go to your elders, you visit your elders, or maybe you invite your friends or your family members to your home. So that is some sort of a tradition or the custom which is usually practiced at home. In the same way now in Constitution also you'll have to remember that other than the rules and regulations, there are many unwritten parts in it. So these unwritten parts are known as conventions. Now let's have a look at the meaning of conventions. What do you mean by conventions? So conventions are the unwritten rules of political morality or behavior followed by successive power holders or authorities for the sake of convenience or expediency. That means these are the unwritten part of the constitution, or maybe they are the customs or the traditions followed by the power holders. Because the power holders, other than the rules and regulations, they have to abide by these customs and traditions. They have to give a lot of emphasis on these customs and traditions. So these are known as your conventions, especially in your political science. Now, these customs of the constitution, so they can also be regarded as the customs of the constitution and the political customs of Britain. Now in Britain, you'll have to remember that the constitution is unwritten. That means you do not have rules and regulations written down in a form of a book. But how is it going to function? How is the constitution of Britain going to function? So this is possible with the help of conventions. So our British constitution is full of conventions. So because of which changes can be brought about, because of which rules and regulations can be made. Now, so besides the written rules and regulations, it is very necessary that each and every country should have the unwritten part. Those are known as your conventions. So none of the countries are free of conventions. Now, why are these conventions necessary, or why are these unwritten rules and regulations a part of the constitution? So let's have a look at it. Why is it necessary? Why should there be the unwritten part of the constitution which are known as the conventions? So the first point which we can discuss it lessens the rigidity of law. Now laws, once it is written down, it cannot be changed, it cannot be altered. So even though there are methods by which these laws can be altered, or maybe these laws can be changed, but there are very difficult processes, or maybe the process for amendment is very difficult, as we have seen in the case of the USA. In USA, since the rules and regulations are written down in a form of a book, so it becomes very difficult to change the rules and regulations. But does that mean that USA is still going to have a rigid constitution? So there has to be some amount of flexibility also. So this flexibility is possible with the help of conventions. So these conventions, it lessens the rigidity of law. So even though the laws cannot be changed, but with the help of these conventions, that means when the customs are changed or when the traditions which have been followed by the country can be changed, so obviously it is going to bring about flexibility in the constitution. So in other words, we can say that the conventions lubricates the laws. That means it makes the laws flexible, because people cannot just follow the same rules and regulations for a long period of time. So there has to be some changes. People do want some change. So they do not want to obey those rules and regulations, strict rules and regulations for a very long time. But how is it going to be changed? How is it going to be altered? So this can be done with the help of conventions. Now next, it keeps the constitution in time with the changing circumstances. Now, the environment which is there, or the surrounding environment, a lot of changes are taking place, isn't it? A lot of changes is taking place, but only if the environment is going to change, and if the rules and regulations are not going to change, then what is going to happen to the people? Are they willing to obey those rules and regulations? Would they like to obey those rules and regulations? I don't think so. The people are going to stick to those traditional rules and regulations. So they want some change. They want some alterations, isn't it? So that is possible with the help of conventions. So what do the conventions do? Keeps the constitution in time with the changing circumstances. So what is the need of the hour? So what are the changes taking place in the environment? So according to the changes taking place in the environment, if the laws can also be changed, then we can say that people are satisfied with the working of the government. People are satisfied with the leaders. So that is possible again with the help of conventions, because these are unwritten, so you can bring about changes in the traditions, the customs or the usages. So it can bring about changes to the constitution with the changes which is taking place in the environment. And we can also say that it is essential for all mixed types of constitution. Now let's take the example of Britain. Now Britain has an unwritten constitution. So they follow the conventions, they follow the customs, they follow the usages, isn't it? So even if the rules and regulations are there, but you find it in very small amount. So very less amount of rules and regulations are written down in a form of a book. So in Britain you can have, or you can say that there are a mixture of constitution. So how is it possible? How is it possible, isn't it? So this is possible with the help of conventions. Because in Britain, you know, you have a monarchical form of government. That means the monarch is the head of the state. That means the Prime Minister advises the monarch. The monarch is still the head of state. And then you have an aristocratic form of government also, because usually the lower house, that is House of Lords, the members usually belong to the aristocratic family. So it is aristocratic in nature. And at the same time, you have a democratic form of government. So these three forms of government function together. The monarchical form of government, the aristocratic form of government, and a democratic form of government. So that is possible only with the help of conventions. Had there been no conventions, then it would have been very difficult for a mixed form of government to come into existence. Okay? So this is a brief explanation about the term conventions. So you have to remember that conventions are the unwritten rules of the Constitution. So besides the written rules and regulations, it is very essential, it is very important for us to know the unwritten parts as well. So those are known as your conventions or your traditions. Now, let's take the example of Britain. Now, in Britain, we have a large amount of conventions which is functioning there, or which is helping the functioning of the government in Britain. Now, we will have a look at some of the conventions which are there in the UK, it is not only in UK which has an unwritten constitution, but you cannot forget USA also, you cannot forget India also. So though USA and India, they have a written constitution, but you can say that they are not free of conventions. So you have a large amount of conventions in India as well as USA. Now let's have a look at the major conventions which are there in the UK. The British Cabinet. Now in Britain or UK, you have a parliamentary form of government. So the Prime Minister is there, so he is the head of the government, but you have his cabinet to assist him. So nowhere in Britain is there a hard and fast rule that there has to be a cabinet, but it is a convention. Now since the cabinet has been established for a very long time, or it has been in function for a very long time, so it is a well accepted fact that the British cabinet is there, and the head of the British cabinet is the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister along with his cabinet ministers are the real policy makers. So they are the real ones who make the rules and regulations and think about running the country. Then you have the office of the British Prime Minister. So the British Prime Minister also plays an important role, because in Britain, even though you have the monarch who is the head of state, but the head of government is the British Prime Minister. So the office of the British Prime Minister is also the result of a convention. Now office of the Speaker and its neutrality. Now in the lower house, that is in the House of Commons, you have the Speaker. So the Speaker is the one who conducts the meetings in the lower house, that is the House of Commons. And there is the convention that neutrality of the Speaker. So though the Speaker might be from the majority party, but when he is acting as a Speaker in the lower house, he has to maintain his neutrality. That means he cannot side with his own political party or speak against other political party. He has to maintain his neutrality. So that is also a convention. So there is no hard and fast rule that the Speaker should side with his political party or go against the other political party, but the neutrality of the Speaker is also a well-known convention which is followed in Britain. Now, the British King or the Queen always acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. Now, in a parliamentary form of government, you know that there are two executive heads, the real and the nominal. So here in Britain, the nominal is the monarch, the British monarch, and it is a well-known accepted fact that the British monarch has to work according to the aid and advice given by the British Prime Minister. So there is no hard and fast rule that the monarch always has to listen to the British Prime Minister, but it is now accepted fact that the monarch always has to work according to the advice given by the Prime Minister. So this is also an example of a convention. And the office of the cabinet is also a convention. So nowhere in Britain will you find that there has to be a cabinet mentioned there. But in order to make the smooth running of the administration, or in order to make the administration run properly, you have the Prime Minister, isn't it? So to assist the Prime Minister, you will need a handful of individuals, isn't it? So they are known as the cabinet. So they occupy the important portfolios, they are in charge of important offices, and at the same time, they are the real policy makers, they are the real decision makers, isn't it? So without whose help, the Prime Minister would have been helpless. So the cabinet is also one of the conventions which is there in Britain. So other than the conventions mentioned in the UK, there are other conventions also which is followed in Britain. Okay, now let's have a look at USA. Now USA has a written constitution That means most of the rules and regulations are written down in a form of a book. So once it is written, it becomes very difficult to bring about changes. It becomes very difficult to bring about alteration. Even though there are methods by which the amendment can be brought about, but the methods are very rigid. It's very difficult. You need a special majority to bring about changes. But does that mean that in USA they are still going to follow those old rules and regulations, isn't it? So though the US Constitution is an old constitution, but till date only 27 amendments have been made so far. But that does not mean that the Constitution of USA is very rigid, but there is some sort of flexibility also. That's why now USA is one of the most powerful countries in the whole world. How is it possible? Are they still sticking to those old rules and regulations? Are they still following the rigid rules and regulations? I don't think so, isn't it? So how is USA able to cope up with the changing environment? So this is all because of the conventions. So conventions are the unwritten maxims of the Constitution. Now, in the USA, basically it was an indirect election of the president. But now, more or less, it has become a direct election. That means people are also getting involved in the election of the president. Because again in USA, you have to remember that there is a presidential form of government. There is no difference between the real executive and the nominal executive. The president himself is the head of state, he is the head of country. So the people now get a chance to vote for their leader, that is the president. So from indirect election, now more or less now the election of the president has become direct. So this is also a convention. So it is not mentioned, it is not written down that the office or the election of the president has to be direct in nature. Then the next one, you have the presidential cabinet. Now since the president is the head of state, he is also the head of country. Now the president cannot work on his own. So he has to have his cabinet ministers to assist him, isn't it? He cannot look after the country all by himself. So he has to have his cabinet ministers. So the office of the cabinet ministers is also the result of a convention. That means the president, he himself cannot have a look at the entire country or manage the affairs of the entire country all by himself. So he has to have some officers, or maybe he has to have some ministers to assist him. So that's why you have the cabinet ministers, isn't it? So these cabinet ministers are individually responsible before the president. And beside that, you know that when the president is selecting the members of his cabinet, they need not be from the same political party. So he can choose members of other political parties. So the office of the presidential cabinet is also a result of a convention. So if the office of the presidential cabinet was not a convention, so maybe the president had to manage the affairs of the entire country all by himself. So what would have been the status of the president? So how would he be able to manage the affairs of the entire country, isn't it? So in order to manage the entire country, you have the president along with his cabinet. Okay, so the presidential cabinet is also a result of a convention. Now the next point is the judicial review. The judicial review, as you all know, that means the Supreme Court has the right to declare those rules and regulations as null and void if it is not made according to the provisions mentioned in the Constitution. That means now Constitution is given a very important position. But now who is checking whether the rules and regulations are made according to the Constitution or not? The Supreme Court. So this is also the result of a convention. So nowhere in the Constitution is there a mention that the Supreme Court has to check whether the rules and regulations are made according to the Constitution or not. But this is also a convention. Now it is an accepted fact that the Supreme Court is going to check whether the rules and regulations made by the legislature or the executive is according to the constitution or not. Okay. So in USA also, though you have a written constitution, but yet it is not free of these conventions as well. So that's why it makes the constitution flexible, or it is able to make the constitution change with the changing environment. And finally, we will have a look at India as well. Now, in India also you have a written constitution. So most of the rules and regulations are written down in a form of a book. But other than the rules and regulations, now there are some conventions also which are followed in India. Okay. Now let's have a look at some of the conventions which are mentioned in India or which are followed in India. Now, the speaker has to be from the Lok Sabha. That means now the Lok Sabha is the lower house, isn't it? So among the members, okay, they are going to choose the speaker. So the speaker is going to manage the affairs of the Lok Sabha. So nowhere in the constitution will you find that now the Lok Sabha has to have a speaker, Lok Sabha has to conduct the meeting of the Lok Sabha. Nowhere in the constitution will you find it. But since it has been in practice for a very long time, now it is an accepted fact that the speaker has to be from the Lok Sabha and he has to manage the affairs of the Lok Sabha. That means he is going to conduct the meetings, okay, he is going to hold the different agenda of the meeting. And besides that, now the president always chooses the leader of the majority party as the prime minister. Now in India also, now since you have a parliamentary form of government, so there are two executive heads, the real and the nominal. So nominal is the president, isn't it? So president is the head of state. So when it comes to appointment of the prime minister, so what the president does is he normally appoints the leader of the majority party as the prime minister. So even though you turn the pages of the Constitution of India, nowhere will you find that the president has to appoint the leader of the majority party as the prime minister. But since it has been followed for a very long time now, since it has been in practice for a very long time, so usually when the election of the Lok Sabha is held and whichever party wins the majority, so at that time what does the president do? He usually appoints the leader of the majority party as the prime minister. So this is also the convention which is followed in India. And there is also convention that the prime minister has to be from the Lok Sabha. Okay. Now the election of the Lok Sabha is held and then the leader of the majority party is appointed as the prime minister. So there is a convention that the prime minister always has to be from the Lok Sabha, that is the lower house or the house of the people. And finally you can also say that there is a convention in India that the retired political or military generals are often appointed as governors. So the governors are the representatives of the center at the state. And then when it comes to appointment of the governors, so there is a convention which is followed in India which says that only the retired political or military generals are appointed as the governors. Okay. So now when we have a look at all of these constitutions, so even though now Britain has an unwritten constitution, it is not free of conventions, it is full of conventions. Usually the working of the British constitution is based on conventions. And then when you have a look at India and USA, so though they have a written constitution, but you can say that it is not free of conventions. So conventions play an important role in the working of the constitution or in the working of the government system. So if there had been no conventions, then most of the constitutions of the world would have been very rigid. They would not be following the changes which is taking place in the taking places in the environment. And then with this we come to the end of the chapter with regard to the explanation of the conventions. And if you want to know more about your conventions, you can refer to your textbooks from page 101 to 107. So with this we come to the end of the chapter. So for your homework, you will be made known through WhatsApp. Stay home, stay safe. Thank you. Have a good day.